Right? Yeah. So it is such a joy and a sacred privilege to stand before you this evening as the bishop of this year's assembly. We gather under this beautiful theme inspired by the beloved hymn, Ponder Anew What the Almighty Can Do, if by his love he befriend you. And I believe that this is a sacred invitation to ponder anew, for it's both urgent and holy. What is it that God is doing right now? What might God do through us if we befriend the world with the same fierce, inclusive love that Jesus has shown to all of us? I believe that we're standing at a crossroad moment as the church, a kairos moment. As we emerge from the grips of the pandemic, the religious landscape has changed and continues to affect the ways that we've been engaging ministry. It is high time for us to ponder anew what the Almighty can do through us to transform this world. There is a growing body of research that shows that the attitudes of adults in this country are beginning to shift. Studies of millennials and Gen Z are reflecting an openness to spirituality that we haven't seen in decades. And I believe that this creates a unique opportunity for us as church. If we are able to focus on loving God and loving neighbor as we ponder ministry in new ways. Now, I know that we have heard the stories of the nuns and the duns and watched as the fastest growing religion in America became nuns, or those with no religious affiliation. We heard of those who were just done with the church. And we began to ask ourselves, well, why? As this research emerged, we learned a few things, some that piqued our curiosity, and some of it was a heavy dose of reality that held up a mirror to reflect a church that didn't look an awful lot like Jesus. But what we discovered is that a growing population of adults are not adverse to spirituality. So please don't misunderstand the growing body of material that talks about these nuns and duns. Many of them are actually looking for a spiritual home, a place to belong, and they're yearning to find peace and purpose. So tonight, I want us to explore what it looks like to engage the spiritually open people that are around us, to explore this new landscape of ministry that's developing around us, not with a sense of anxiety, but with a sense of hope, curiosity, and deep compassion for those around us. So to get us starting here tonight, thinking about how we might engage this new growing population of spiritually open people, we center ourselves in this year's assembly theme, Ponder Anew. Now this hymn reminds us that God is in fact still acting, that God is still befriending, that God is still creating, that God is still about resurrection. But sometimes we need to open our eyes and our hearts to perceive it. Pondering anew means that we stop assuming that what was will always be. It means that we notice the longing in our neighbor's eyes, the spiritual questions that are whispered between friends, the ache even in our own bones for peace and purpose. Let's be honest, this landscape that we find ourselves has shifted drastically. In an earlier version of this address, I tried to put together a hopeful message looking at our synod by the numbers, which is hilarious because I've been up here so many times saying it's not about the numbers. But what I was trying to do was tell a story of what those numbers meant. And other than our mission support being up, and the fact that we ordained more people than we retired, which are hopeful metrics to celebrate, the truth is that no matter which way I sliced the data, I just had a hard time finding a story of good news by the numbers this year. And I know this is something we're all feeling in our bones. We don't need to be reminded that practicing Christians dropped from 45% of the US population in 2000 to just 20% in 2023. Nearly my whole adult life, this church has been shrinking. And there are some who say that if this trend continues, the mainline denominations will be completely depleted by 2040. Weekly attendance is down. Denominational loyalty is fading. For many, the church, as they knew it, no longer feels like home. But here's the twist. Spirituality is not in decline. So I want to share a bit of research from our friends at Barna. The fact is that 188 million US adults say that they're spiritually open. That's 3 in 4 of every adult in the United States, saying that they are people looking for meaning, peace, purpose, and belonging. Which is a really good thing, church, because guess what the church has to offer? Meaning, you have a vocation. Peace, the peace of Christ that surpasses all understanding. Purpose, you are a beloved child of God. And belonging, you belong, all of you, in this community. You see, the landscape has not gone barren. It's just gone a little wild. We must learn to cultivate it in new ways. So here's the good news, friends. The Spirit is still moving, and the pandemic cracked many of us open. People began asking deeper questions about mortality, about meaning, about God, and many are more open now than they have ever been. In the body of interviews that Barna did, in the study of engaging the spiritually open, and I can share that with anyone who wants that, just let me know, it's a whole long study. But 74% of adults want to grow spiritually. 79% believe in a higher power. 44% feel more open to God since the pandemic than when we look specifically at Gen Z, or those who are in their 20s, right? 20s and early 30s, that number rises to 59% of them. Y'all, people want to talk about God. They want to talk about faith. They want to talk about spirituality. Which means that the majority of adults in this country want to talk. And they want to find peace. And they want to find belonging. And they want to discover that their life has a purpose. Church, this is not a crisis. This is an invitation. So here comes the hard part, where we have to hold a mirror up to who we have been. And I'm making broad strokes about Christianity as a whole, right? Because when people talk about Christians, they don't ask about, well, what did the Lutherans specifically do, right? We just get lumped in with all the rest. So while Barna's research says that people are hungry for what only Jesus can offer, peace, forgiveness, and hope, the hard truth is that they don't always trust the church to deliver it. I've seen this bumper sticker, and I think it sums up the sentiment that many of these spiritually open people have. Jesus, save me from your followers. The research holds out that what church is presenting in its institutional structure, well, it's not something that people are looking for. So the top 5 reasons of why they leave, according to Carrie Nieuwhof, who's a voice out there on the emerging church. He says, reason number 1, irrelevance, hypocrisy, and moral failure. We aren't a church that looks an awful lot like Jesus. Number 2, God is missing in the church. They're leaving for their own unique path to discover God and spiritual practices. I can do yoga in the woods. I can go to meditation. I can discover things on my own. Reason number 3, legitimate doubt is prohibited. For far too long, the Christian church has been saying it must be right, it must be known, and here are the answers. And so it's led us to say that it's hard to have an honest conversation in the church these days. They're not learning about God. Ouch. They can't understand a word that the pastor is saying, and they can't connect to what the kids are learning. We have a generational gap where the next generation isn't discipling the next. And so now we've got 2 and 3 and maybe even now 4 generations of undiscipled people out there. It's an invitation. They're not finding community. Our previous Surgeon General said we're in an epidemic of lonely. Loneliness is on the rise, as Tom reminded us in Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. And they're not finding community when they drop in and out of our worship services. And here's the hard truth of what the data reveals. They're leaving because they've experienced judgment, exclusion, or hypocrisy. People love Jesus, but they often struggle with some of us who are his followers. And the church's silence when it comes to Christian nationalism was something the research named specifically. And so our lack of speaking out against the rise of Christian nationalism in this country, of saying that that's not Jesus, is something that they're looking for. The role that the church has played in inflicting trauma on its people, including the young, the lack of space to ask deep and searching questions that help people create meaning out of the chaotic world that's around us. These are the reasons at the root of why they're living in such a wild landscape. So again, here comes the invitation to ponder anew. Can we become a church that reflects Jesus more authentically? So David Kinnaman, who is the CEO of Barna, calls this a new wineskin moment. He says the majority in our midst are open to tapping more deeply into their spiritual life. They're curious, and they're more open to Jesus than we might otherwise imagine. The old forms may not be able to hold what God is pouring out for us now, because we're not called to defend institutional survival. We're called to discern what the Spirit is doing, to ponder anew, and to respond with flexibility, humility, and courage, because we know what the Almighty can do when by his love he befriends us. So let's take a look at these spiritually open people, explore what they're looking for, and discover some of the reasons they aren't coming into our churches anymore. Because the spiritually open are not strangers to us. They are our neighbors. They are your adult children. Their barista at the Starbucks this morning who said, "Good morning, Father." I never know what to do with that. I'm like, do I stop him and say, "Bishop"? I usually just say, bless you, I hope you have a beloved day. So 45% of U.S. adults today are part of this non-practicing Christian group. And of that 45% of U.S. adults who are non-practicing Christians, 82% of them are part of this spiritually open community. So stop saying they don't want to talk about faith. Engage them. Talk with them. It doesn't have to be do you know Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior moment. It can be a tell me about your tattoo. Clearly you believe about imagery enough and art enough that you've permanently put it on your body. Tell me about that. Of those who identify as non-Christians in the United States right now, 46% of them are open. Many still hold a positive view of Jesus, but not of the church or Christians. They're not lost. They're exploring. And many of them are just waiting for someone to walk with them without judgment. So what is it that they're seeking? Not dogma, not arguments, not a perpetuation of our church politics. They're not going to argue about the color of the carpet in the sanctuary. They want peace. They want healing. They want to know that their pain matters, that their doubts are welcome, and that hope is still possible. So here's the sobering truth. People are open to Jesus, but they're often closed to Christians, not because of theology, but because of how we've been treating people. So let's get honest. If we want people to meet Jesus, they need to encounter him through us, in our love, in our humility, in our listening, in our truth-telling. I saw this at work at St. Mark's, about how many times our young, it was mostly the young moms, when we'd engage in these Lenten and Advent practices of just stillness and silence, they'd be like, oh my God, that's so great. Because I go, and I can just sit. Or the story of the Altar Guild leader in North Carolina that I read once of how they serve in the Altar Guild because they can just come into the sanctuary on Saturday and sit in silence. What a beautiful story of how church is helping people find peace and healing and purpose and meaning. So let me offer four shifts that might help us ponder anew and how we might meet these spiritually open people in this moment. Number one, listening is the new evangelism. Let me say that again so you hear it in the back. Listening is the new evangelism. For far too long, this church has been on transmit. And I think it's time for us to be receiving their stories, receiving their pain, receiving their ponderings, to walk with them and listen to them and hear deeply about how they feel God is moving in their life. People want us to listen to them without judgment. It's not a debate with them. Listening has to become our new evangelism. Peace is the new apologetic. And I know apologetic is one of those fancy church words, but peace then becomes your point. This is the reason that you exist. And how do our liturgies, how do our activities, how do our journeying with people lead people into a deeper sense of peace? Because let's be honest, this world is chaotic, and people are looking for peace, not arguments. So can we be a peace-filled people? Curiosity is a spiritual practice. Spiritually open folks aren't looking for certainty, which I'm sorry to say our evangelical Christian friends are going to find out awfully hard, because they got an answer for everything. Gay? Don't be. Divorce? Don't think about it. Pornography? Don't even, right? Walking with people who are spiritually curious means that we should take curiosity and play as a spiritual practice. So I'm thankful that Anne-Marie is with us as we learn to play with our faith, to wonder and experience things from a child's point of view and asking those questions. I think of how many times it's so joyfully kids will come back to the altar rail. Can I get another snack? But what joy could we find in learning to embrace faith like that? Beloved, Jesus is still the answer. Always has, always will be. And despite everything, people still love Jesus. So let's show them the Jesus who heals, the Jesus who forgives, the Jesus who liberates, the Jesus who loves without condition. They are longing to see a church that is in both words and deeds. So do not shy away from your justice ministries. Do not shy away from making loud the actions that you're doing to show a Jesus who is embodied in your ministries. So what are maybe some of our next steps for congregations? What does this look like on the ground? I believe that we can embrace empathy and spiritual backstories. So many spiritually open people were raised in the church. So let's honor those complex stories that they carry. I know I was joking with Carrie as we've been doing things here for Assembly. I keep bumping into, oh yeah, I used to go to that church. And my inner evangelist is like, oh, tell me more. Why? Tell me more. Whoops, no, don't go to that one. There we go. Create spaces for dialogue, not just service. Could your congregation host a faith and life night? Because not everybody's ready for Sunday morning. There's trauma, there's baggage, and those doors don't even open. Y'all, I've been going around. It's not just, I know I keep harping on Lansdale's reverse configuration here. But honestly, I finally put it on my bishop form. Tell me what door to come in. Because the one that looks like the door probably isn't. I know they're not ready to join us on Sunday morning, and we got congregations full of people who want them to join us on Sunday morning. That may not be the truth for where we're going. Remember, new wine skins. And that's okay. But I think if our curiosity of engaging these people is with us, then we can be curious and meet them where they are. Offer healing ministries. Can't say this enough. Offer healing ministries. I give so much thanks for the people of Grace Broomall that reimagine themselves into this healing and wholeness and wellness center that's offering counseling and education for adults and yoga and a whole host of things as a way to show people that we are a church who really believes that Jesus can heal people. What if our churches were known as these centers for healing and not just doctrine? Because I think that's what we've been known for a long time. Well, the church you send your children to church to faith them up. They'll get the doctrine, they'll learn to love Jesus, and we'll make them good citizens, right? I think the times are shifting. Help train your people to listen and curiosity. Teach confirmation students and adults to ask better questions and then listen deeply. This fall, rostered leaders will be learning at our Bishop's Convocation about a process called community organizing. about a way that we send people out to listen to stories. Because as Ian teaches us with human-centered design thinking, it's about listening to the story of the other. You have to listen to what the needs are in the community. And far too often, this is what I see happening. Y'all sit at the council table and you're like, I know, they need a potluck. I know, they need a bazaar. And they might, if that's the fellowship niche that you want to be in. But I'm telling you, if you go out and you interview these people in your community and you ask those questions, you're going to get at much more tangible needs. So we did this in Upper Bucks this year, and I was interviewing one of the local Upper Bucks community leaders who'd served as commissioner and in and around different places. And I said, what keeps you up at night? Simple question, but kind of curious. He said, the ambulance group may shutter this year. And that would mean that the people in Upper Bucks would face a 45-minute ambulance ride. You could hear an audible gasp in the room too, so I'm glad you guys did that too. I said, churches, can you help keep the ambulance open? And they all nodded their heads. But if we're not asking those questions, we don't know those needs. So, train your people to listen and engage in curiosity. And invite people to take one step closer to Jesus. You don't have to convert someone on the spot. This is not the days of the street corner evangelism. But help them take the next step, and then just trust the Spirit to do what the Spirit always does, and gather a harvest from a mustard seed, right? These little acts that we do. I know my mom is always famous, working in real estate. One of the questions that she would always ask new homeowners is, do you have a spiritual home? Not, do you have a church? Because we were in Virginia and a lot of people were like, do you have a church? But do you have a spiritual home? Do you have a place? Because I'm journeying with you as you relocate, and we often dealt with a lot of military folks. And oftentimes they'll say, well, I was Episcopalian, and we'd refer them to Episcopalian stuff. And very often they said no. And so Mom would always say, well, we're members at St. Peter's, and if you'd like to come check it out, we have worship at 8:30 and 11. Sometimes they'd come, sometimes they wouldn't, and that's okay. It's just planting seeds. Friends, I believe that this is a holy moment for the church. Not a moment to retreat in fear, but to move forward in hope. The hymn says, ponder anew what the Almighty can do if by his love he befriend you. If God has befriended you, how might you befriend those around you? I pray that we're a church that welcomes the wounded, embraces the seeker, and reflects the healing love of Jesus. And as your bishop, I'm going to work as hard as I can to make us a reflection of that. Because the harvest is still plentiful. Jesus is still beautiful. And the Spirit, oh, that sweet, sweet Spirit, is still blowing in this place. So as we go from assembly this weekend, may you go not with anxiety, but with anticipation. May you go not to fix people, but to listen to them. May you go not to protect the church, but to embody the living Christ. I pray that the Almighty might help us do this, to ask better questions, to hold space for healing, to speak the name of Jesus with joy in our hearts, and to meet people right where they are, and not where we need them to be. May we be an assembly who is always pondering anew because when we do, we see what the Almighty can do to raise the dead, to breathe new life, and call new generations into the church. Amen.